Dissemination of research. The main three things we'll be talking about here are papers, posters, and presentations, although it is important to understand that there's other channels to disseminate your research. And by dissemination, I'm talking about any means it takes to get your research out to the public so that they're aware of it. I'll spend the most time talking about papers and the peer review process because I get a lot of questions about that. But we'll also talk briefly about posters, some key things, and presentations, although we've talked about both of those in more detail in previous lectures, so I won't spend a lot of time on that here. Introduction. So what is dissemination? It's really a broad term, and it's any and all means of ways that you share your research, the results, why it's meaningful, and all that with the world. And so that can be papers, presentations. You might be doing outreach for kindergarten through 12th grade. Maybe you're integrating some of your research into the classroom. There's so many ways to disseminate your research. But I do want to mention that I think dissemination is just as important as the research itself. Imagine you cured cancer. Wow, what a breakthrough. But then imagine you didn't tell anybody about it and nobody knew. Well, that would do no good. So research is absolutely useless, and I would even argue it's a waste of time and money and resources if the results of that research are not shared with the world, even if the results of that research are negative. Knowing what doesn't work is just as important very often as what does work. So why is dissemination important? Well, when you're doing research in graduate school, one, you're probably going to be working on a funded project, and there are those that provided that funding, probably a government agency. Well, they would like to see the results of your research. That's why they're paying for it. Also, dissemination is needed if others are going to benefit from your research. Maybe they want to build on it. Perhaps you develop some kind of numerical algorithm. Then people use your algorithm to design a device and they go build and test it. And then a company later on picks that up and commercializes it. And now it's out and people are actually using something that was enabled by your algorithm. So as I mentioned before, your research does absolutely no good. And I would even argue is a waste of time if nobody else knows about it. I think also exposing people to research helps motivate them, and we can use that as a way to recruit people into that discipline or perhaps another discipline. And it's not just recruiting people to work in those areas, it's also recruiting funders. Somebody with some money might suddenly realize, hey, this is a neat area of research and I believe in it and I want to invest in that. So lots of reasons to motivate interest in your topic. And then the last thing, of course, your research is not beneficial to anybody if nobody knows about it. Back to the, if you've cured cancer, but you don't tell anybody, what good did it really do? So how can we disseminate our research? Well, the big three that people talk about is papers, posters, and presentations, but there are more. Of course, there's publications, but maybe you write an article for a magazine or a newspaper or a trade journal. There's project reports, and I think project reports is a great opportunity to practice for a publication. Just think, you get a first shot at writing something, and you're thinking to yourself, oh gosh, I have to do monthly or quarterly reports, and what a drag. Well, think of that as writing a rough draft for your paper or your dissertation, and you can literally copy and paste that stuff into your publication, and it's already gone through one sort of review. And so I tend to go overboard on my project reports, and I very much think of it this way. This is practice for a publication, and it's also copy paste into your dissertation when you get to that. Posters is a great thing. Us academics, we love to hang posters all over the place. I'm a fan of posters that are eye candy, and because that attracts attention, and then people walk up to it and read about it, and suddenly they're excited by the research. Conferences and presentations, this is a pretty obvious one, attending conferences because you're seeing other people's research and you're also disseminating your own. There's outreach activities. Maybe you're volunteering in a high school classroom where you can talk to students about your research and get them motivated. Maybe there's career options they haven't even considered until they talk to you. And there's also websites. Maybe you have a website for yourself. Maybe you're doing a personal branding thing. You develop a website about you and you put your research on there. Well, people can go there and learn about your research and learn about you. Maybe there's a blog. Perhaps you can answer questions on a discussion board that comes out of your research because you probably know something that others don't about that topic, and you can help others. So lots and lots of ways to disseminate your research. We talk way too much about posters, papers, and presentations, but there are many more. Papers. You can broadly categorize papers into peer-reviewed and non-peer-reviewed. In a peer review process, you'll submit your paper. That paper goes out to a bunch of experts in the field. They read the paper and see, is this valid science? Is it new and novel? Is it interesting to people? And if not, they toss it out. They would decline the publication. And it's really up to the editor, but the editor is going to rely on what the reviewers say. So most people don't really count something as valid science unless it's peer reviewed, but lots of crazy stuff sneaks through the peer review process. There's also a lot of good stuff that's not peer reviewed. For example, textbooks. Textbooks are awesome, but they're not peer reviewed. Then there's the non-peer reviewed. As I mentioned, textbooks is one example, but another really common one is conferences. Now, some conferences are considered peer reviewed, most are not. So when you write a conference proceedings, most of those just get accepted. And so conference proceedings, I'm not saying people are going to publish things that are intentionally wrong, but it has not gone through a review process by other experts. So you'll tend to see more mistakes made. I think also in the non-peer reviewed literature, since it's non-peer reviewed and it counts a bit less than a peer reviewed journal, you're going to see a lot less breakthrough things announced in the non-peer reviewed literature, because if somebody takes that, repeats it, and then does a peer review, well, do they get credit for that? And that's a little up in the air and questionable, but as I mentioned, there's some people out there that don't even really count it as research unless it's been published in a peer reviewed article. Is that fair? I don't know. I'll let you decide that. I do get the question a lot. Describe the peer review process, or how do I get through the peer review process? So let me take you through what is the typical peer review process, and then I'll give you some advice of how to survive the peer review process, because it can be brutal from time to time. So it starts off with writing a manuscript. And in fact, I should talk about a step before that. If you want to have a great paper, do great research. And so I could argue this whole process starts with great research, but we're just talking about the publication part. We're going to assume great research has been done, and then you write a manuscript. A manuscript is what you call it before it's an accepted paper. And hopefully that's also been reviewed by some of your partners in your lab, perhaps your advisor, and then you submit it to a journal. So you try to pick a journal that's prestigious, has a high impact factor. Some other things you may consider: do you want to go to an open source journal? Do you want to diversify your publications? In my research, I try to diversify. So I do some lower impact but open source journals. I also go for the prestigious journals and everything in between. And that's my approach. Some people just stick strictly to the high impact journals. That's equally respectable. But you pick a journal and you submit to it. And there's typically a whole process there, by one, uploading your manuscript, but very often you have to write a cover letter. You have to enter all the author information. It's a whole process. And on each paper, you'll see listed a corresponding author. Now, in some parts of the world, it's the corresponding author that seems to get credit for everything. At least here in the United States, the corresponding author is more just the secretary, the person who's submitting the manuscript, responding to it, the person who people would email if they have a question on the paper later on. So typically, this is the advisor or the leader of the group, because students graduate within a few years, and if somebody 5 or 6 years down the road has a question, then I would probably want that to come to me because my email address is staying the same. Maybe not, but so that's the corresponding author. And there's definitely other parts of the world where that's a super prestigious position, not so much in the USA. At that point, the manuscript gets assigned to an editor. And the editor himself or herself may not be the one that reads and reviews your journal. Instead, they look at that and they pull together a team of experts, probably from their database, and then hand that out to them. So yeah, usually there's a database, and the The editor can type in keywords about what the paper's about. It pulls up a bunch of people. It tells them if they're already reviewing something. And it's a whole system that these editors use. So they assign peer reviewers. Then the editor coordinates with them. So typically these systems would automatically email people in the editor's name, and they'll get a message like, hey, this is Journal of whatever. We have this paper. We would like you to peer review it. And it gets really tough here for the editors. So be patient if your review takes a while. But, maybe only 1 in 5 reviewers that are requested actually review the paper. There's a lot of no responses, or I'm too busy, or whatever. So it's very difficult to coordinate this. If you've never served at an editor, you probably wouldn't appreciate this side, but there actually is a lot of work for the editor, even if that editor themselves does not review your paper. But anyway, they keep doing this until they finally get enough reviews back. Now, they give instructions to the reviewers. They try to identify the experts in the field. So your work, before it's published, is also going out to your competition. And there's really nothing you can do about that. I recommend just not even thinking that way and don't worry about that, because there's nothing you can do. But that is what happens. Anyway, these peer reviewers, they have some responsibilities. One, they have to identify if your research is novel enough to be worthy of publication. And usually the journals with the higher impact factors have a higher threshold for what is new enough and what is novel enough. Also, maybe you've done something new, but it's not very significant, right? These journals are about making money, so they don't want to publish something that nobody's going to read. So it needs to be significant. It needs to be useful to their readers, and of general interest. And then, of course, these reviewers are expected to look if the results are correct. Now, that relies on the experts possibly to do a lot of work. They can't necessarily rerun your simulations and redo your experiments. So they really are just giving it the sniff test. So there is the possibility that stuff can sneak through the peer review process that isn't necessarily intentionally wrong, but mistakes get through, mistakes happen. So when you're reading a peer-reviewed article, don't just assume that that is 100% accurate and correct. Keep an open mind, but people do their best with this. Anyway, these reviewers, they get back to the author with their feedback. At that point, the editor compiles the feedback from the authors and submits the review back to the original authors. Now, at this point, you could get a letter, hey, sorry, your manuscript's declined. This isn't necessarily rare, but you can have a manuscript decline if it just clearly is not new or novel enough. Certainly, if you've, and there are a lot of authors that do this, they'll publish something cool somewhere, and then they'll take that same thing, make minor little tweaks to it 20 different ways, and submit it to 20 other different journals, and they try to get their citation indices and their number of publications up. And crazy enough, the way our metrics work, that actually works for people. I don't do that because I'm here to do science. I'm not here to spend my time just writing all these papers. But anyway, a high impact journal is going to recognize this and say, hey, this is not new enough and novel enough compared to these other things. And so we're just going to decline it outright. Or maybe it's written so poorly. If it's an English journal, for example, and has just really, really bad English and it's not even readable, it could just get declined. So I don't want to say that's rare, but most of the time it's not just that flat out declined. Usually the manuscript will get accepted with some changes requested, but other times, probably just as rare as just getting outright declined as getting outright accepted. Hey, your manuscript's accepted, no changes needed. I think that's only happened to me a handful of times in my entire life. I think sometimes these reviewers just want to find something. And I've even heard of people as a strategy, they'll put some small mistakes in the paper just to give the reviewer something to find, so potentially they won't find a bigger issue. I don't think that's good practice. I wouldn't operate that way, but I've heard that. So what happens, I will say 8 out of 10 times, is that the manuscript is conditionally accepted with some revisions. And that means you'll have to read the reviewer's responses and revise your article, and also write a letter detailing the changes that you've made to your manuscript. So the authors revise the manuscript, they write this cover letter, they list all of the reviewer's points, point by point. You can't group them together. So what is the point the reviewer made, and then how the authors responded to that, how it resulted in a revision to the manuscript, if there was a revision. If there's no revision, they need to pretty clearly justify why they're not really responding to that comment from the reviewer. At this point, the authors resubmit the revised manuscript. And it either sometimes, depending if it was a really good review just with minor changes, it probably won't go back to the original reviewers. The editor will just look at that and make sure, yes, okay, these minor things were tweaked. Now, if there was more significant changes requested, then the editor will probably send it back to the original reviewers and say, hey, did these authors adequately respond to what you told them? So it starts all over. We go back to step 5. The editor coordinates with these reviewers. And like I said, if it's a minor change, this wouldn't happen. If it's more significant changes, it goes back. Then they submit their review, and this repeats. However, this just does not repeat indefinitely until the paper gets accepted or declined. Sometimes they only give you one chance through this. And if your revisions didn't cut it or weren't acceptable to the reviewers, it's just declined at that point. Sometimes you'll get 2. I can't imagine getting 3 or 4 chances. I don't think I've ever been that deep into a review, but you know, it probably happens. Here's my advice for publishing. When you're writing the abstract, this is where you want to be a salesman. Remember the point of the abstract. This is the little thing that people read to see if they want to read your whole article. Now, you're not mis-selling your paper and saying things that the paper does that it doesn't actually do. Don't think that way. You're not a slimy used car salesman. Instead, you want to adequately state what your paper is saying and the value of it, and maybe even brag a little bit, but write that in a way that people are going to say, wow, this sounds like a really good paper. Now, if your abstract is super sloppy and ugly written and hard to read, people are going to assume the same thing about your paper. So make this one of the more well-polished aspects of your paper. Always submit quality manuscripts with excellent writing and graphics. Go overboard on this. You can reuse your writing. Now, once you publish, that belongs to the publisher. You can't publish those same words and graphics, but you can use those same graphics in a presentation if you reference it. And you can copy and paste your text into your dissertation, but reference it. So I always go overboard and I reuse a lot of things, particularly my graphics. And another reason that I go overboard on graphics is, you know what? You may get on the cover, right? They're looking for things to put on their cover. And if they see a paper that has particularly snazzy graphics, maybe you get on the cover just for that reason. Also, when you're submitting papers, follow their formatting requirements exactly. Many of them have automatic checkers while you're submitting, but sometimes they'll come back a day or 2 later and say, hey, you didn't meet this, this, and this. It's just booted out of the system. And you have to start the whole submission process over again, hopefully fixing whatever your problems are. So be really crazy accurate about this. And all journals, they'll have a list of their formatting rules. Almost always they have a template, usually a LaTeX template, a Microsoft Word template, maybe others. And so follow that exactly. I also recommend create a template if one doesn't exist, but almost always there is a template. Just write immediately in that. Try not to fall into this mentality of, oh, I like to just write and then I'll format it later. And I think that's being lazy and ultimately creating more work for you, because things can happen in that reformatting process. You know, symbols get changed. So I highly recommend creating that template and just writing directly in that. The other thing, this is a very emotional experience. So I think once you submit a manuscript, just forget about it. Move on, pretend it didn't happen. And it can be several months before you hear back. I've had reviews or processes that have taken close to 2 years, and I've also had them that took 48 hours. Typically, it's more like 2 to 3 months for the entire process. Sometimes your review is a little on the hostile side, or they didn't read everything and they're making kind of silly points. Regardless of that, don't argue with the reviewers. So you always want to respond humbly and politely to the reviewers. I'll have more on that on the next slide. If you do get declined, learn why. Don't just get angry. Learn why. Very often you're just not selling your paper right. Maybe you didn't describe adequately why it's new and novel, and it's not obvious to people reading it. So make things like that more obvious and submit to another journal. Now I want to talk a little bit more about the peer review process, because as I mentioned, this is emotional, and sometimes what comes back from the peer reviewers is a little bit mean or hostile, or they've missed key points. The job of the editor is to tone down any kind of hostility that might be there, but things get through anyway. And what can happen sometimes is the reviewers just sort of skim your paper, they miss key points, and then come back and say you didn't make these key points. And that's very frustrating when it's obvious they did not read the whole paper. But you could get upset by that, or maybe you could look at yourself and say, perhaps I didn't organize this paper that well. I didn't make it easy to read and easy to skim in a way that people would still get the key points. And I think that's important to consider if you really want your papers to be referenced a lot. Always, 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 no matter what, no matter how hostile it is, when you're responding to the review, you want to be very polite, very respectful, and never argue with them. And there's ways to word things that I'll show you in a few minutes. And I've got this picture over to the right, and this is something that I tell my students. When you are writing your review, pretend you are pond scum and they are some magical deity, and write it from that perspective. Put yourself in that framework. It's hard when you have ego and frustration. You're trying to get your paper through, but maybe this can make it a little bit fun. But write that humbly and that kindly. And try to swallow your ego for a bit, because despite your feelings or what the reviewers are saying, very likely they have good points. Even if they miss something and one of their points is dumb, well, perhaps your paper wasn't making that point very clear. So they likely have good points no matter how much it hurts. Keep that in mind. So I want to go through some typical comments from reviewers and perhaps how you could respond. And I'm picking comments that aren't necessarily hostile, but when you've poured your heart and soul into a paper, these comments might sting a little bit. All right, authors do not seem to be aware of state-of-the-art and are missing key previous work in their citation. So they're essentially telling you, you don't know what you're doing. You're not even sure what other people have done. Now, you could say, sorry, reviewer, heck with you. Of course, we know what we're doing. Or that would not work. The reviewer wouldn't like that. Instead, we thank the reviewers for helping us to improve our discussion of state-of-the-art. We have added the following citations to our manuscript, but are not aware of any other key papers on the subject. It would help us tremendously if the reviewer could identify any keywords we are missing so that we can cite that work. Notice what we're doing here. We're thanking the reviewers and sort of admitting, hey, this was a deficiency in our paper. Now, maybe in your mind, you're thinking you did an adequate job. There's nothing else significant. You added a couple little things that maybe didn't offer anything new over what you've already had cited. But now you're kind of putting this on the reviewer to provide these other papers. And that doesn't always work, but if you want to challenge the reviewer in a very polite way, this might be how you do it. Here's another one. This research does not appear to be new and novel. And this one comes up a lot and can be worded different ways. But essentially, you're saying you haven't done anything new. You're publishing stuff that's already been known for a long time. And again, if your heart and soul went into this, and this is your research, you might be offended by that, and you might be wanting to, throw fists or something at these reviewers. Rhetorical fists, not physical fists. So here's maybe how you could respond. We thank the reviewers for helping us make this a stronger manuscript by highlighting that we have done a poor job at explaining the novelty and significance of our research. We have added the following paragraph to our introduction to clearly identify what is novel about our research and why it is important. We have also revised our abstract and conclusion to reiterate these points and to be consistent. So you're admitting, hey, reviewer, you're right. We did a poor job at this. So we're not arguing that it's new and novel, because then you enter a debate. Instead, you're saying yes, we've done a poor job at explaining that. You see the difference there? I think that difference can take you from what may be combative to something that may be more constructive. You're admitting that the reviewer's right, not necessarily about it being new and novel. It sounds that way, but the reviewer was right in that you did a pretty weak job of explaining the novelty. Even if you think you did, say something like that. And then you go on to say how you revised your manuscript. Posters. I actually really love posters. And I know we've talked a lot about this in previous lectures, so let me just hit on some key points. I like to make my posters eye candy. In other words, they just look gorgeous to attract attention. And this can be tough sometimes because usually if you're doing some kind of poster presentation, there's rules. Maybe you have to use a certain template. You're required to break things down into little blocks. And I actually don't like posters that have all these like sort of equal sized blocks scattered throughout. I like some kind of giant picture going on there. And I'm a little bit of a rebel for the rules, but I don't want to turn the rest of the world into rebels like myself. But we've done things before in the past, like instead of putting a picture, we'll put a tablet behind the poster. So now there's an animated picture. And well, of course, where we did that, they now have this rule, no use of tablets. So they're making up rules because of us. So I tend to be a rebel. I'm not advising you to be a rebel, but think outside the box of what you could do to make your poster eye candy. Make it unique and memorable. That's what this is about, right? If you're doing a poster presentation, you're probably competing with a bunch of other posters. It's noisy. It's maybe hot in there. And somebody's walking around to see what they want to look more into. And what do you think would attract more attention? Some ugly poster that just has these equal sized blocks and a lot of text, or something that has just some gorgeous picture that's not pixelated or anything like that? So you want it to be eye candy and memorable and unique so that you'll stand out. I definitely think you should minimize the use of text, make it so that it's not the dominant thing, but not to the same extreme that we talked about with presentations. I'm almost opposed to any text in presentations because you're presenting. You're not supposed to have the audience reading because then they're not listening to you. Whereas a poster does need to be understandable on its own. Very often it's requirements that you have an abstract or something written on there. So there's definitely a bigger role for text on a poster than a presentation, but try not to have it dominate the poster because text just looks boring. If I'm walking around a poster competition or poster presentation and I see a lot of text, I'm thinking to myself, wow, it's going to take a lot of work for me to go up and understand what's there because I have to read all these words. But if there's some gorgeous picture there that makes just in one picture, makes it instantly understandable, well, that's probably going to attract my attention. Think of billboards. Billboards only have people's part attention and for 20 seconds or so, yet they have to communicate a message. Think something along those lines for posters or movie posters, elements of those in your poster. So the text needs to be large enough to see clearly. And you can almost think of this as multiple tiers too. Like if you want a message to come across from very far away, and maybe that's just the title of your poster, that's got to be the biggest. And then if you attract somebody's interest, well, they'll get a little bit closer. And now you can have some smaller text, but still plenty big to see. And then you can have, well, now I'm really interested, and they walk right up to the poster, and then you could even have like 12-point font where they can get the details, but that can be a smaller part of the poster and not dominate the poster. I also recommend when students are presenting a poster to bring some gadgets. If you've designed and built some things, bring those things that you've designed and built. Or if you're too small to see, is there a 3D printing lab on campus? Can you get a larger version of what you've done 3D printed? Even though it's not real and it's gadgety, anything like that will make people have more fun at your poster and make them remember you. Bring business cards or maybe pamphlets about your research lab and leave this with people. Very often they'll contact you afterwards. Dress professionally. Remember, when you dress up, you're not dressing to look intelligent. What you are saying and your research should make you look intelligent. You dress out of respect for this whole event. If you show up to a poster competition and, jeans with holes in it and some ratty, snotty t-shirt, people are going to say he's not or she's not really taking this that serious, and so I'm really not going to take their poster that serious. Whereas maybe a suit and tie or a nice business dress, something like that. That says you take this serious, and then people will also take you more serious. That said, I do think posters are less formal than giving a presentation. And so it's really just up to you. Do you want to wear that sort of business formal outfit, or is it more business casual? I think it's probably best to overdress than underdress. So just understand your audience and the purpose of the poster presentation, and dress appropriately. Definitely don't dress sloppy. But these posters, I think, are great networking opportunities, even more so than a presentation. Because when you present, very often, as soon as you're done, somebody's immediately up there, and now people aren't thinking about you anymore or whatever. Whereas at a poster, you're shaking hands, you're talking eye to eye. It's much more personal, and use that to start building your professional network. Presentations. This is definitely something we've hit on before and talked a lot about, so I'm just going to hit the key points. But here's a very representative slide of what you might see at a presentation if somebody's describing this thing called a Lundberg lens. And there's a lot of text. Yeah, there's a picture. Sometimes it's even smaller than that, but it's not entirely sure what that picture means. Hopefully I'm talking, I can help explain it. But then somebody might be reading all these words, so they're not really following what I'm saying. And this really is not that effective of a slide. Let me present an alternative. So don't do this. This slide is a lot less busy, but through an animation, I have communicated everything that was on the previous slide, but a person can look at this and within 2 seconds, get everything that was in text on the previous slide. Now, they might not know all of the details, but they can kind of see, yeah, there's some sort of wavy thing coming into this circle kind of thing, and it seems to be concentrating the waves at one point at the other side. And I don't really know what that equation means, but it's probably an important equation. But they get that within like 2 seconds, whereas before, how long would it take somebody to read that stuff? And maybe they could read quickly, but to understand longer. So a slide like this is much, much more effective because they don't spend as much time digesting what's on the slide. It's much more rapidly interpretable. And they will be listening to you to then explain things, that this is a Lundberg lens and it focuses waves at the opposite side of the lens. And this equation is the relative permittivity as a function of the radius of this thing. And it makes for a much shorter, much classier way of presenting your ideas. So now this takes a lot more work. And if you're doing a presentation that you're doing once a week as a lab group meeting, maybe this graphic isn't worth that. But certainly if you're presenting at a conference, definitely do stuff like this. And especially if your talk is very short, maybe you want to talk for an hour, but they give you 15 minutes. Things like this can make you communicate a lot of information very effectively, very quickly, and in a way that's going to entertain the audience and have them remember you more than they remember other people that have more like what was on the previous slide where it was just full of text. I'll end this just by mentioning some other dissemination channels. Of course, there's doing outreach activities. There's helping your advisor incorporate your research into the classroom. But another great one is art. So we collaborate with a local artist here in El Paso, Texas, Laura Turon, and we've done a lot of cool things with her. This picture on the bottom is a spatially variant lattice painted onto the walls of an immigration center here in El Paso. And these spatially variant lattices is a key part of the research that we are doing. And I think nothing says welcome to the United States of America better than a spatially variant lattice. She also had a school bus and built a giant spatially variant lattice in that the kids could go inside and climb on. We worked together on this road sculpture. By work together, she did 90% of the work, but she was using our algorithm to generate the angles of these lines. So we can change the angle of those lines, yet try to maintain spacing between them. And in this case, the angle of those lines encode the GPS coordinate of the statue. And it's a really interesting statue. I'm not going to spend too much time, but it's in the middle of a traffic circle and tells the story of El Paso, Texas, and the cooperation between all the different types of people we have in El Paso. Pretty neat stuff. And this is another way to disseminate your research. And what's cool about something like this is you're reaching out to audiences that would typically not be an audience of your research. Very cool, very rewarding.